The dining hall had been arranged with care, its long wooden tables covered in white linen and scattered with small arrangements of lilies and roses, her late friend's favorite flowers. Candles flickered along the edges, their glow dancing against the walls, casting a softness that could not mask the heaviness in the air. The memorial dinner was not meant to be festive. It was a solemn gathering to honor a woman whose absence still felt impossible. At the center of it all sat Margaret Turner, 63 years old, her posture straight despite the weariness she carried in her green eyes. To anyone looking, she was composed, the kind of woman who had lived through enough storms to know how to carry herself with dignity. She wore a navy dress, modest and plain, her silver gray hair swept into a loose bun, but inside she was a tangle of grief, memories, and a gnawing unease she couldn't quite name. Her husband William sat beside her. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-60s with a voice that always carried further than it should. Tonight, though, he was quieter, his gaze lowered often to his plate. To others, he appeared the image of a grieving friend, respectful, subdued. To Margaret, his silence felt heavier, almost guarded, though she couldn't put her finger on why. The evening was dedicated to Eleanor Hart, Margaret's best friend for nearly 5 decades. They had met as teenagers in church choir, when Eleanor, with her dark hair and booming laugh, pulled Margaret into a duet no one had rehearsed. Since then, they had shared everything: weddings, births, deaths, countless secrets, and more cups of coffee than either could count. Eleanor had been the sister Margaret never had. Steady, fierce, and dependable. Eleanor's husband, Thomas Hart, was there too. He sat at the other end of the table, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. His once confident presence seemed diminished now, his shoulders curved inward, his gaze flickering between his glass of wine and the people speaking. His grief was understandable. He had buried his wife only weeks ago. Yet as Margaret watched him, she noticed how often his eyes drifted. Not to his children, not to Eleanor's photograph displayed at the head of the room, but toward William. When Margaret caught Thomas's gaze lingering, he looked away quickly, pretending to focus on his food. William shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fork clinking against the china with unnecessary force. Margaret's chest tightened. It was only a moment, a passing glance, but it struck her with an odd sharpness. Guests stood, one by one, to share stories of Eleanor. There were tales of her generosity, how she once cooked meals for an entire neighborhood during a blizzard. Laughter filled the room at the memory of her boldness, sneaking into a wedding reception they hadn't been invited to, convincing Margaret to dance as though they belonged there. Tears fell when someone recalled Eleanor singing at a hospital bedside for a dying stranger, her voice carrying peace into the final moments of a life. When it was Margaret's turn, she rose slowly. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her glasses. Looking around the room, she saw faces expectant and somber. She began softly, her voice low but steady. Eleanor was not only my friend, she said, pausing as her throat tightened. She was my anchor. She was the kind of woman you could call at 2 in the morning when life was falling apart, and she would arrive. No questions asked. Hair in curlers, coat half on. She gave without measuring, loved without hesitation. I will miss her for the rest of my days. The room murmured in agreement. Margaret's eyes flickered briefly to William, expecting some sign of comfort. Instead, he was staring down at his plate, avoiding her gaze entirely. Her chest sank with a heaviness she couldn't explain. As the evening wore on, Margaret tried to focus on the stories and laughter, but unease threaded itself through every smile, every toast. When Thomas stood to speak, she caught it again, his glance fleeting but unmistakable, toward William. And this time, William didn't look away fast enough. Their eyes met for half a second too long, a silent exchange Margaret wasn't meant to see. Her stomach tightened, her grief twisting into something darker. She shook it off, telling herself she was tired, that grief played cruel tricks on the mind. But somewhere deep within, a whisper began. Something isn't right. The candles burned lower, the plates emptied, and yet that whisper grew louder. Margaret smiled politely, thanked the guests for their kind words, and bowed her head during the closing prayer. But inside, she was unsettled. That night, as she folded Eleanor's photo into her purse to take home, Margaret promised herself one thing. She would not let that whisper go unanswered. The days following the memorial dinner should have been filled only with mourning. Margaret expected to spend them writing in her journal, tending to her garden, or perhaps sitting by the window with a cup of tea, letting memories of Eleanor wash over her. But instead, she found herself replaying every glance, every whisper, every awkward silence from that night. William had always been a talker, the kind of man who filled every silence with small jokes or commentary. Yet at the dinner, he had hardly spoken. When he did, his words felt clipped, rehearsed, almost as if he were afraid of saying too much. Thomas, too, had seemed strangely restless, his eyes darting whenever Margaret was near. At first, she told herself it was nothing. Grief made people strange. Men in particular did not always know how to handle loss. Perhaps William had simply been uncomfortable, surrounded by so much sorrow. Perhaps Thomas's glances were just the wandering eyes of a widower, lost and searching. But the whisper inside her grew louder. One afternoon, a week later, Margaret was folding laundry when she heard William in the study. His voice was low, too low for someone merely chatting with a colleague or an old friend. She leaned against the hallway wall, her heart quickening, trying to catch fragments. "Not here, we have to be careful." Her hands trembled as she held a neatly folded shirt. He spoke again, softer now, but she caught one word. Thomas. When she stepped into the room a moment later, William startled, fumbling with his phone before setting it face down on the desk. "Who were you talking to?" she asked, keeping her tone light though her pulse thundered in her ears. "Just business," he replied too quickly. "Some mix-up at the warehouse." Margaret nodded, but the shirt in her hand slipped to the floor. For years she had lived beside this man, memorizing his habits, his tells. He was lying. That night, lying awake beside him, she stared at the ceiling. She thought back to Eleanor's illness. How often had William insisted on stopping by to help? How many nights had he claimed to be working late, returning home smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers? At the time, she had believed his excuses. Who would ever imagine such betrayal, least of all with the husband of her closest friend? But now those pieces began to stitch themselves into something undeniable. 2 days later, Margaret attended a church luncheon where Thomas also appeared. He looked gaunt, his suit hanging loosely from his frame. As she watched him greet others, she noticed again that nervous flicker in his eyes, darting toward the door every few moments as if expecting someone. When William arrived unexpectedly near the end of the luncheon, Thomas visibly relaxed. It was subtle, a small drop of his shoulders, the release of tension. But Margaret saw it, and when William brushed past Thomas, their arms grazed, their heads tilted ever so slightly toward one another, too familiar to be accidental. Margaret's stomach twisted. This wasn't grief. This was something else, a secret binding them together. She tried desperately to shake it off. At night, she would sit by her vanity and talk aloud to Eleanor's photograph. "Tell me I'm wrong," she whispered one evening, tracing the frame with trembling fingers. "Tell me my mind is cruel with grief." But the silence gave no answer. The unease soon seeped into her daily routines. Cooking dinner, she watched William's phone light up with messages he never explained. Walking through town, she thought she saw Thomas slip into a cafe just moments after William had turned the corner. Even in church, where solace should have been hers, she caught William glancing toward Thomas during hymns. Her suspicion grew into a quiet torment. She could no longer look at her husband the same way. When he touched her shoulder, she flinched. When he kissed her goodnight, she felt only the weight of deceit. Yet she said nothing. Margaret had lived long enough to know that words spoken without proof could destroy more than they revealed. Instead, she carried her questions like stones in her chest, heavy and unyielding. At the next family gathering, she watched more closely than ever. As guests laughed and clinked glasses, she noticed William excusing himself from the table at the same time Thomas slipped away. She followed slowly, her pulse hammering. Turning down the side corridor of the hall, she saw them just ahead. Two men leaning too close, their voices hushed. Though she couldn't hear the words, the sight alone was enough to confirm the whisper she had tried so hard to silence. Something was happening between them. Something Eleanor never would have forgiven. And Margaret, heartbroken as she was, knew she would no longer look away. Margaret had always believed that time revealed truth. It was a lesson her mother taught her as a girl. People can hide their words, their faces, even their intentions. But time, Margaret, time always pulls the curtain back. She decided then that she would wait, watch, and let time speak. One late afternoon while William showered, Margaret found herself standing at his desk again. His phone lay face down, the way he always left it now, as if the very screen might betray him. Her fingers hovered above it. For decades, she had never once checked his messages, never doubted his loyalty. But trust, once cracked, begs for answers. She pressed the button. The screen glowed to life, a password prompt staring back at her. He had never locked it before. Margaret's chest tightened, but fate seemed to lend her a cruel hand. A moment later, the phone buzzed with a notification, an unsaved number, a message preview that slipped through before the screen dimmed. Just a few words. "I can't stop thinking about you." Her breath caught. When William stepped from the shower, humming softly as though nothing in the world weighed on him, Margaret turned from the desk, her face schooled into calm. But her heart thundered so violently she was sure he could hear it. The next day, when William left for errands, Margaret searched the study. She didn't know what she expected to find. Perhaps nothing. But then, tucked inside a drawer beneath old receipts, she discovered a small envelope. Inside was a card. Her breath froze as she read the handwriting she knew too well. Eleanor's. The card wasn't dated, but it was filled with lines that made Margaret's hands tremble. "I don't know how to live with this guilt. I love my family and I love her. She's my sister in everything but blood. And yet I can't seem to let go of you. Please don't let her find out." Margaret dropped into the chair, the card trembling in her grip. Eleanor. Her Eleanor. The woman she trusted with every secret of her life, confessing to the one betrayal Margaret never imagined. Tears blurred her vision. She pressed the card to her chest, gasping as if the words themselves had stolen the air from her lungs. It wasn't just William. It had been Eleanor, too, all along. The betrayal cut twice, once from the man she had built her life beside, once from the woman she had called sister. Memories flooded her mind, every detail sharper now in the cruel light of truth. The nights Eleanor had asked Margaret to stay home while she and William handled things. The hushed conversations that ended when she entered the room. The way Eleanor had looked at William sometimes, with a softness Margaret thought was friendship. It was all there. She had simply refused to see it. Later that evening, she noticed something else. As William dressed for a business dinner, he slipped a tie she had never seen before around his neck. Curious, she peeked into the closet once he left. There, hidden behind old coats, was a small gift bag with a tag attached. To W, with love, T. Thomas. Margaret's hands shook as she lifted out the tie box, still wrapped in crisp tissue paper. The betrayal wasn't a distant memory from Eleanor's final months. It was alive, still breathing, still continuing. Her grief, once heavy but quiet, now boiled into fury. The betrayal was no longer a whisper. It was a shout. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, the card from Eleanor beside her. She traced the handwriting, the loops and curves of letters that once brought her comfort. How could Eleanor, even facing her final days, choose deceit over honesty? Margaret stared at the candle flickering in front of her, her jaw tight. For 63 years, she had lived with dignity. She had forgiven slights, endured hardships, and kept the peace. But this she could not forgive. She knew then that silence would only make her complicit. If she stayed quiet, she would become the keeper of their secret, the protector of their sin. And she refused. She folded the card carefully, placed it in an envelope, and slid it into her purse. Evidence. Proof. For the first time since Eleanor's passing, Margaret felt her sorrow shift into something else. Resolve. The truth had come to her doorstep, and she would not turn it away. Margaret had always believed herself to be a patient woman. Patience had carried her through raising children, through tight financial years, through her husband's stubborn streaks and sharp words. But patience now felt like cowardice. The card in her purse, Eleanor's guilt inked on the page, was a weight she could not carry alone. The following week, Margaret's resolve sharpened. She began watching William with the eyes of a stranger, no longer the trusting wife of 4 decades. Every move was a clue, every word an opening. On Tuesday morning, William announced he'd be attending a late business meeting. His voice was steady, but Margaret noticed the way he avoided her eyes, the slight tremor as he buttoned his cuff. She didn't confront him. Instead, she waited until he left, then followed a half hour later, her heart pounding as she parked a street over from the restaurant he had named. William's car wasn't there. Margaret's breath caught. She drove slowly, aimlessly at first, until instinct tugged her down a quiet road toward the outskirts of town. There, at a small inn with a dimly lit sign, sat his car. Next to it, unmistakable even in the dark, was Thomas's sedan. She didn't go inside. She didn't need to. The sight alone was enough to confirm what the whispers, the glances, and the letter had already told her. The betrayal was real, alive, and continuing even after Eleanor's death. Margaret gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. Part of her wanted to storm inside, to drag him out into the night and demand answers. But another part, the wiser, older part, told her this moment wasn't the right one. Anger would only end in denial. She needed something undeniable. She drove home in silence, her mind calculating. If William and Thomas believed their secret safe, they would make mistakes. And when they did, she would be ready. Over the next 2 weeks, she began her quiet investigation. She checked their credit card statements, a task William had long since ignored, leaving finances mostly in her hands. Hotel charges appeared, not frequent, but enough. Small gift shop purchases, restaurants in towns neither of them had reason to visit. At the library, she learned how to recover fragments of deleted messages from old backups. Hours passed as she sat hunched over borrowed software, her heart breaking as words appeared on the screen. Short messages, stripped of dates but not of meaning. I miss you already. She suspects nothing. Tonight, the same place. Margaret printed every piece she could salvage, sliding them into a folder she kept hidden behind books on her shelf. The folder grew thicker with each discovery, proof piled upon proof, each page another dagger. Yet even as her fury grew, so did her grief. At night, she would sit in her armchair staring into the dark, wondering how many evenings Eleanor had smiled at her while knowing the truth. How many times had William kissed her cheek with lips still carrying Eleanor's shadow? The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was a theft of trust, of love, of the sacred bond that tied lives together. But sorrow alone wouldn't restore her dignity. Truth, exposed where all could see, would. The opportunity came when Eleanor's family announced another memorial dinner. This one larger, more formal, meant to honor her legacy in front of extended relatives and community friends. The date was set, the invitation sent. Margaret felt her chest tighten at the news, but then she knew. This was her moment. Eleanor's life had been celebrated with flowers and laughter, but now her truth would be spoken, not in whispers but in the full light of day. She spent the next nights preparing, the folder of messages, the card Eleanor had written, the receipts and statements. Each piece was tucked into a neat stack, bound with care, not as a weapon of rage, but as evidence of truth. One evening, as she sat at her desk sorting the papers, William walked in. "What are you working on?" he asked casually, sipping a glass of scotch. Margaret looked up, her face serene though her heart thundered. "Just some old letters," she replied. He nodded, uninterested, and walked away. And in that moment, Margaret felt a strange calm. For the first time in weeks, she was no longer the confused, grieving wife. She was a woman carrying truth, and soon she would place it before everyone who thought they knew the story. As the memorial dinner approached, Margaret rehearsed her words quietly each night. She would not scream. She would not sob. She would simply reveal. And when she did, there would be no hiding, no denial, no more lies. The day was coming, and William had no idea. The announcement of the second memorial dinner spread through the community like a quiet tide. Eleanor's family wanted something bigger this time. A formal evening in the banquet hall of the town's historic inn, with catered food, music, and speeches. They called it a celebration of her legacy. For most, it was another chance to gather, to remember a beloved woman. For Margaret, it was an opportunity, the only stage wide enough, the only audience large enough, for the truth. In the days leading up to the dinner, she moved carefully, her every action deliberate. By morning, she carried on as if life were normal. She prepared William's breakfast, folded laundry, and answered calls from friends who asked whether she would be attending. She smiled politely, assuring them she would be there. By evening, once William retreated to his study or slipped out for his so-called meetings, Margaret spread the contents of her folder across the dining table like pieces of a puzzle. The messages, the receipts, the card from Eleanor, each fragment fit into a narrative no one could deny. She rehearsed the order in which she would reveal them, deciding how to begin and how to end. There could be no room for doubt. At night, Margaret sat by the window in her bedroom, staring out at the lamplight spilling across the street. She thought of Eleanor. She wondered what her best friend had felt in those final months, torn between love, guilt, and betrayal. Did Eleanor ever intend to confess? Did she believe her secret would be buried with her? Tears would sometimes come, hot and unrelenting, until Margaret wiped them away and reminded herself, truth was not cruelty. Truth was justice, not only for her, but for the sanctity of the life they had all built together. The closer the date drew, the more William seemed at ease, unaware of the storm building under his roof. He hummed as he shaved, joked with neighbors on the porch, and even kissed Margaret's cheek in passing. She let him. It was easier that way. The calm before the storm. On the morning of the dinner, Margaret woke before dawn. She pulled on her robe and walked to the kitchen, her heart already restless. The house was silent, but she felt the air thick with what was coming. She made herself tea, then sat at the table staring at the folder. The weight of it was almost physical. She thought for a moment of leaving it all buried. After all, what good could come from tearing open such wounds in public? But the thought passed quickly. Silence was what had allowed the betrayal to grow in the shadows. Silence had protected them, William and Thomas, while leaving her in ignorance. She would not be silent any longer. By midday, she carefully packed the documents into her purse, sliding the folder beneath a silk scarf. She dressed with care, a simple black dress, a string of pearls, Eleanor's favorite brooch pinned at her collar. It was not armor, but it felt like it. As she applied a touch of lipstick, she studied herself in the mirror. The lines on her face told of decades lived, of love given and sacrifices made. Tonight, those same lines would frame a woman who refused to be humiliated in silence. The banquet hall buzzed with warmth as guests arrived that evening. Tables draped in white linen were set with polished silverware. Soft music played from a corner, mingling with the murmur of conversation. Photographs of Eleanor decorated the walls, from her youth to her final years. Reminders of a life lived with vigor and laughter. Margaret entered with William at her side. He smiled broadly, shaking hands, offering condolences, even laughter. She watched him, her expression serene. How easily he played the role. How little anyone suspected. At the far end of the room, she spotted Thomas, already surrounded by relatives. His eyes darted once toward William, a glance so fleeting most would miss it. Margaret did not. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her composure, greeting guests with grace. As the evening unfolded, speeches were given, stories shared. Glasses clinked in toast to Eleanor's memory. Margaret sat quietly waiting, her purse resting against her chair. Her hands trembled beneath the tablecloth, but her expression remained calm. When the host finally asked if anyone else wished to say a few words, Margaret rose. The room quieted, respectful, expectant. She smoothed her dress, lifted her chin, and stepped forward. Her heart pounded, but her voice was steady as she began. I loved Eleanor Hart more than I can put into words. She was my sister, my confidant, my dearest friend. But there is something about her life and her death that must be spoken tonight. The words hung in the air like the first crack of thunder before a storm. The audience leaned forward, uncertain but gripped. Margaret's hand brushed the purse at her side. The time had come. The room hushed, every clink of silverware, silenced as Margaret stood with her purse at her side. The soft piano music ceased mid-note. Dozens of eyes turned to her. Neighbors, friends, Eleanor's children and grandchildren, even William, who shifted uneasily in his chair. Margaret steadied her breath. Her fingers brushed the brooch at her collar, Eleanor's brooch, as if drawing courage from the very woman whose memory was being honored. I have listened tonight to stories of Eleanor's kindness, her courage, her laughter, Margaret began, her voice calm but edged with a weight that commanded attention. And every word is true. She was all those things. But there is another truth, one buried beneath the surface, one that Eleanor herself carried in silence. Tonight, I can no longer remain silent with her. Confusion rippled through the room. Murmurs rose, people exchanging glances. William's jaw tightened. Margaret reached into her purse and drew out the envelope, holding it delicately between her fingers. "This," she said, her eyes sweeping across the room, "is a letter written in Eleanor's own hand, not long before her passing, a confession of a secret that weighed heavily on her soul." She unfolded the paper slowly, the candlelight catching the ink. Her voice trembled at first but grew stronger with each word she read aloud. "I don't know how to live with this guilt. I love my family and I love her. She's my sister in everything but blood. And yet I can't seem to let go of you. Please don't let her find out." Gasps echoed across the room. Eleanor's daughter covered her mouth. Thomas's grandchildren looked around in bewilderment. Margaret folded the letter carefully and set it on the podium in front of her. Then she lifted her gaze, steady and unflinching. "That letter was written to my husband, William." The silence that followed was deafening. William shot to his feet, his face flushed crimson. "Margaret, stop this madness," he barked. "You're twisting—" "Sit down, William," Margaret said firmly, her voice slicing through his protest. "I am not twisting anything. The truth doesn't bend to your denial." She reached again into her purse, withdrawing the folder now, thick with papers. She opened it and held up printed messages for the room to see. "Here are the words of two men who believed themselves hidden. Messages between William Turner and Thomas Hart. Words of affection, of secret meetings. She suspects nothing. Tonight, the same place. Dozens of them." The color drained from Thomas's face. He stood stammering, "Margaret, please, not here." "Not here," Margaret's voice cut sharp. "Where else, Thomas? Where else but in the presence of those who loved Eleanor? You betrayed her while she lay dying. And you, William," she turned to her husband, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "You betrayed me, your wife of over 40 years. Together you turned love and trust into shadows and lies." The room erupted in whispers, shock, disbelief. Some covered their faces, others shook their heads in silent outrage. Eleanor's eldest son stood suddenly, his voice choked with grief and fury. "Is this true, Father? Did you, while Mother was sick, did you betray her like this?" Thomas's mouth opened, but no sound came. His shoulders sagged, his eyes filled with shame. He bowed his head, the silence of guilt louder than any denial. William's fists clenched at his sides. "Margaret, you've lost your mind. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Margaret interrupted, her voice steady, unshaken. "You chose lies. You chose to desecrate the marriage bed, to spit on the vows you made before God, to betray not only me but Eleanor, in the cruelest of ways." Her hands trembled now, but she refused to falter. She turned back to the room. "This is not a story of grief alone. This is a story of betrayal, and tonight it is no longer hidden. You all deserve to know the truth, to remember Eleanor for the woman she was, not for the secret these two men hoped would be buried with her." The room was silent again, save for the quiet weeping of Eleanor's daughter. The weight of Margaret's words pressed down on everyone present. William sat heavily, his face pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. He had no words left. Thomas's shoulders shook with quiet sobs, his shame plain for all to see. Margaret closed the folder, her hands steady now. She looked out at the crowd, at faces shocked, grieving, betrayed, and she felt a strange release. The truth was no longer hers alone to carry. She stepped back from the podium. "I will not apologize for speaking. I have carried this burden long enough. Let it be known. Let it be remembered. I will not live in silence for their sins." With that, she returned to her seat, her chin lifted high, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Around her, the storm of whispers began anew, but within her, a calm had taken root. She had spoken. The curtain had been torn down. There was no going back. The banquet hall dissolved into chaos after Margaret's words settled like shards of glass across the room. Guests whispered in clusters, their faces stricken with disbelief, while others openly confronted William and Thomas. The air, once thick with the warmth of shared memories, now burned with betrayal. Eleanor's daughter, Catherine, approached her father with tears streaming down her cheeks. "How could you?" she cried, her voice cracking. "While Mom was sick, while she was fighting for her life. This is what you were doing." Thomas buried his face in his hands, his voice a low rasp. "I made a mistake. I was weak. I loved her, but—" "No," Catherine cut him off sharply. "You don't get to call that love. You broke her. You broke all of us." The words hung heavy, final. At another table, William's sister glared at him with unmasked disgust. "You always were selfish, William, but this is cruelty I can't even fathom." Margaret sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap. Her heart ached, but her face remained calm, a mask of quiet dignity. She did not gloat, nor did she cry. She simply bore witness as the truth unraveled lives around her. William finally turned to her, his voice low, desperate. "Margaret, please. You didn't have to do this here, like this. We could have spoken privately, worked it out between us." She lifted her gaze to him, her green eyes steady, unyielding. "You made your choices in the dark, William. I made mine in the light. Do not speak to me of privacy when you traded it for lies." He looked away, shame hardening into anger, but he had no defense left. By the end of the evening, William sat alone at their table, his shoulders slumped, no one daring to console him. Thomas was led out quietly by his son, who walked 2 paces ahead, refusing to look at him. The once celebratory memorial had become a reckoning. When Margaret rose to leave, several guests touched her arm gently. Some whispered words of support. "You were brave. You did the right thing. Eleanor deserved the truth." She nodded but said little. Words no longer mattered. The truth had already been spoken. The ride home with William was silent. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale, but he said nothing. Margaret stared out the window, the streetlights flickering across her face, her mind strangely calm. She had braced herself for regret, for guilt, but none came. Only a profound release. That night she slept alone in the guest room. For the first time in weeks, she drifted into deep, uninterrupted sleep. The weeks that followed were heavy with fallout. Neighbors who once waved to William avoided him now. His colleagues at the warehouse whispered, their respect eroded. Thomas retreated into seclusion, his family fractured, his reputation stained beyond repair. Margaret, however, walked differently. She carried herself with a quiet strength, not prideful, but firm. The whispers that once followed her carried no sting. She had spoken her truth, and with it, she had reclaimed her dignity. One afternoon, she found herself sitting in her garden, the sun warming her face. The roses Eleanor had helped her plant years ago bloomed brightly. Margaret traced a petal gently, tears pricking her eyes. She spoke softly, as if her friend could hear. "I loved you, Eleanor. Despite everything, I did. And I will remember the best of you, not the worst. But I had to tell them. I had to tell myself." Her voice broke, but she did not sob. The grief was still there, but lighter now, as though the weight of secrecy had been lifted with the telling. When William tried to apologize weeks later, standing awkwardly in the doorway of her sitting room, Margaret listened, but did not soften. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice low. "I lost my way. I want to make it right." She looked at him, her face calm. "There is no making this right, William. There is only living with the truth of what you've done, and I will live without you." He flinched but said nothing more. That night he packed a small bag and left for his sister's house. Margaret watched from the window as his car disappeared down the street. She felt no triumph, only peace. Months later, Margaret stood in the same banquet hall where she had spoken the truth, but this time for a charity event she helped organize in Eleanor's name. Guests smiled at her warmly, their respect evident. She spoke again at the podium, her voice steady and sure. Eleanor's life was filled with light, she said, and though shadows came, they cannot erase the brightness she brought to this world. We honor her not by silence, but by truth. As the audience applauded, Margaret felt something stir inside her, a sense of renewal, of stepping into the next chapter of her life unbound by betrayal. That evening she returned home, poured herself a glass of tea, and sat in her armchair by the window. The night air was cool, the stars spread across the sky like scattered jewels. She thought of Eleanor, of William, of all that had been lost, and all that she had reclaimed. For the first time in a long time, Margaret smiled. The betrayal had nearly broken her, but it had also remade her, stronger, braver, and unafraid of the truth. And as she closed her eyes, she whispered to herself, "I am free."
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.